All right.
And he's wearing purple.
Can I ask you a question about secondary suites?
No.
Please.
Okay.
Well, how do you explain to people that city council has such a bizarro land process where everybody has to come before council, waste all this time, hours and hours, sometimes almost days, to get this done?
You know what I've been reflecting on is that, and I don't want to jinx it for the rest of the day, but we approve the vast majority of these. And what for me is interesting is to focus on the ones we don't approve. So for example, today, I think we did not approve only 2. And one of them was actually because of landlord-tenant. No, we didn't approve 3. And no, 2, sorry. And they were both because of landlord-tenant kinds of issues. People were complaining about their neighbors and their bad tenants, which actually is not a land use issue. It's an issue for 311 in the community standards bylaw. So in my mind, it would make way more sense for administration to have a checklist, to go through the checklist and to make the decisions without having to come to council. And for those exceptions where there's a landlord-tenant issue or a bad neighbor issue, deal with them through our existing mechanisms. Really, you know, I felt bad because on one of them, the neighbors seemed to have a very legitimate concern with what was going on there, but really, legally, that ought not to influence our decision. So it's a bizarro process. That's a good way of putting it.
But it did, like it did.
I can't tell you whether it did or not because I'm not a mind reader, and I can't tell you what my colleagues were thinking. I can tell you that it should not. But many other things should not. So for example, Councillor Pootmans today asked a very smart question about, are we allowed to ask people if they've talked to their neighbors? Yeah, you're allowed to ask them. And it should have absolutely no bearing on your decision because the neighbors don't get a veto. And in fact, council has several times rejected mandatory asking of your neighbors. So it's a really weird situation. And although we're going through them really quickly today and everyone's on their best behavior, you know, the next 2, we had significant community opposition because they don't like the neighbor. And again, that's not supposed to be a land use decision. And I fear that we put ourselves at risk when we have all this airing of the laundry at our council meetings.
How does it
Are
get
these
fixed?
letters included then in the package for the councillors and public to read?
Because by legislation, it's a public hearing. And because it's a public hearing, it means there is a time period where people can write letters or show up to council. And I try to stop them if they're veering way, way, way off topic. But I also am trying to respect the fact that people have taken a day off work and come to council because this is their chance to talk about something that's important to them, even if it shouldn't indicate our decision. So how do we fix it? You know, there was a report from the University of Calgary School of Public Policy last week that said that Calgary is the worst place in Canada to be poor. And it's actually the worst place in Canada to be poor specifically because of housing. And I'll remind people, as I always do, that this is an important part, not the whole thing, but an important part of the solution. Calgary is also the only city on that list that they examined where we have to go through this rigmarole for safe, affordable secondary suite housing.
So how do you fix it?
Is there a magic number when you fix it? I mean, you have 38 today, like if they want to hit 50, then we're going to fix it?
I don't think that's going to work. The challenge here is that, as I've said many, many, many times, I feel like we can do this scrum every second Monday. As I've said many, many, many times, council has never said the current system works. Only one member of council is on record, that's Councillor Chabot, is saying the current system works. Everyone else knows it's broken. The problem is every time we try to fix it, we can't quite get a majority of votes. Every other city in Canada, with the exception of Burnaby, British Columbia, every other city in Canada has come to terms with this, have realized that it's an administrative procedure, not a council procedure, and they've legalized the ability to apply for a secondary suite in every neighborhood in the city. That is, and I continue to say it, and I've been saying it for more than 10 years, that is the right solution here. I do not know why we are still so tied up in knots about it.
Kind of a little bit off topic, but same topic.
Oh, what?
Airbnb.
Yes.
Came up with a lot today. In those, I think it was just
In one of
one.
them, in one of them.
You said, you know, things maybe on the horizon. What can we actually do?
It hasn't really become a major issue here. It has become a major issue in other cities. And for now, we're monitoring the situation very closely to see what kinds of policy decisions other places have made. to see if in fact we're going to have to incorporate those in Calgary. It's not a burning issue here yet, but it's always a good idea to stay ahead of these things.
So what do? You have to get them a business license, make it a home occupation? How does it work?
I'd prefer to see some kind of a licensing or permitting mechanism in place, and it's really to ensure the safety of the tenants. In the sharing economy, you've heard me say this in other contexts, ensuring people's safety is primary. There is a reason that we have regulation in certain industries, so I'd like to see something like that. The challenge is that other city governments have really been struggling with this, and I'd like to see what's worked in other places.
Sir, do you have any thoughts on Councillor Maglioka's advice for people who want a secondary suite, that maybe they should just buy in an area where it's zoned?
I remember that when we were talking about Access Calgary and whether you should have Access Calgary in places where there is not transit, it was easy to say, well, why'd you buy a house there if there wasn't transit? But you didn't ask to be in a car accident and become disabled. You didn't ask to have an aging parent who suddenly needs help. So I think that is a little bit misguided. I think one of the challenges I've got that was really raised by that story, though, is that even when we reject them, the rationale is often extremely murky. Today wasn't so bad, but the particular case that you wrote about in your story today was actually one of the most perplexing decisions we've made on secondary suites. Nobody spoke in opposition. The neighbors didn't submit very many letters of opposition. Not one member of council spoke up against that particular secondary suite, and yet it was voted down 7-6. It would have passed if all members of council had been there. It was a very, very, very strange decision, and I think that citizens are right to be frustrated when they don't even know why their application is being approved or denied.
Are you still convinced that the majority of Calgarians would support citywide secondary suites, and why?
Every single poll that has been done on this subject, which is I raised in the context of the plebiscite question 2 council meetings ago, every single poll has shown a significant majority in favor, regardless of how you ask the question. I remember there's one poll that was commissioned by the opponents of secondary suites on council, my colleagues who oppose it, and they deliberately tried, and I don't mean this maliciously, they were actually experimenting with some language, and the pollster actually tried to ask the question in many different ways, and even in the most difficult way, the one that he knew would get the most opposition, he still got 60% in favor. And with the exception of one poll that was done on a Sunday afternoon, which showed sort of a tie, every other poll that we've seen has shown massive majorities in favor of this. It's just not a massive majority on your city council and in a few community associations. The other thing I'll just say about this, since we're just rambling on about secondary suites today, is that even the community associations have changed. We used to get every single community association except 1 or 2 opposing it. Now there are only 1 or 2 community associations that oppose them because they've educated themselves on the topic. And in fact, the letter from the Strathcona Community Association, which frankly is not part of the city known to be very welcoming to change often, the letter that they had on the one we just did was very thoughtful. It said, these are our neighbors' legal rights. As long as they meet these things, it's not our place to say. And I think more and more community associations who've educated themselves on this issue have really moved in that direction.
So best case, let's just say best case scenario, everybody gets on side, everyone's gung-ho to fix it. So how reasonably long would it take to make it citywide?
It's difficult. Well, I mean, if council voted to do it, we could have the bylaw before us in a couple months after the advertising and get it done. I'm not sure this council is in a place to do that yet. I think most of them are saying we're going to live with this until after the 2017 election and then look at it again. If anyone's got a great idea on something they think they can help move the ball down the field that'll get the support of the majority of members of this council, I'm happy to look at it.
But you would like to see administration, just so clear, you would like to see, if it was up to you, would it go to administration? They would go through a checklist. Could you explain, if it was up
Sure.
to you, what would be the plan?
Let's be very clear here. A lot of people say that secondary suites are illegal in many neighborhoods in Calgary right now. But remember that you always have the right to apply. We cannot pass a law that says you cannot apply to ask for a secondary suite. And remember, all a secondary suite means is a stove in your basement. So we heard today that someone's renting it out as a rooming house, but there's just one kitchen. Frankly, I think it would be a lot safer and better if there were 2 kitchens in a situation like that. So it's really applying for the right to have a stove in your basement. And if you apply for that, why should you have to come to council? When you apply for a development permit for anything else, if you want to build a garage, let's say, you go through administration and they go, all right, here are the rules. Are you within the rules? Are you meeting code? Is it safe? And if so, you're approved to go forward, and your neighbors have the right to appeal that if they've got grounds for appeal. And then you move forward, and you don't have to have the spectacle of people coming and talking about their senior parents or bringing their husband in a wheelchair, their 37-week pregnant wife, to council and telling us these sob stories that really should not have any impact on our decision anyway.
Do you feel there's any need to remind members of council, though, that these decisions are supposed to be made in terms of compliance with the land use bylaw and not anything else?
They know that very well.
So when we're done.
Do they, sir?
Well, they do. They know it, and maybe that's all I'll say about that.
Looking forward to fluoride.
Oh my gosh, okay, fluoride. So, some years ago, when this first came up, council made the decision with a vast majority without doing any research or going to the public. And at the time, I said that was not a good idea. And in fact, I proposed at that time, let's actually do a scientific study. And it's interesting to see that exact same proposal come back 5 or 6 years later. Now, I will tell you that there were a number of members of council who very legitimately said, the science on this is not why I'm making the decision. The science doesn't matter. For me, this is a moral issue, or it's a jurisdictional issue. We should or should not be putting things in the water supply, or public health should or should not be something that the city does. If those members of council still feel that way, then they really ought not to ask for the scientific work to be done if it's not going to change their mind. For those of us who would like to see the science and would like to make decisions based on the science, I think it's a really good idea to do some science.
You can't say, oh, health, it's not our jurisdiction, and then you go and approve low-income bus passes, which isn't your jurisdiction, right?
There are those of us who would make that argument, yes. I believe that the well-being of the people in our community is our jurisdiction, and we have mechanisms to improve their well-being, whether it is investing in parks and sports and recreation, or whether it's other public health interventions. And so I'm perfectly happy to do things when it improves the quality of life of the people who live here.
You mentioned before on the secondary suites, every poll and stuff. No, but just to relate to fluoride, you just mentioned on the secondary suites, excuse me, every time you see a poll and the favoritism and stuff like that, when you speak to, dental hygienists or dentists or people in the medical field, what are they telling you about fluoride?
This is a very interesting situation because every poll I've seen on this one is about half-half split. It's very, very close, and certainly the plebiscites we've done in the past have been very, very, very close. However, when I talk to people in the medical profession, especially dentists and dental hygienists, I am hearing unanimously that, well, not quite unanimously, there's some holistic dentists out there, but almost unanimously, that they have seen significant increases in tooth decay, especially in children, and especially in low-income children, since council made this decision.
Sir, on the school playground issue, the new schools, would you agree with Councillor Maglioka the city dropped the ball?
I don't want to blame the city or the school boards. The point is it's fixed now, and we'll make sure that the signage is up appropriately when schools open in the future. There's a lot of open